As James mentioned, this is really part 2, but a lot of you are joining in for the first time in this class. Don't worry about that. I'm going to do a 5-minute review, which will get you a running start if you've not had this material before. And I think a lot of the material today will stand on its own. We're covering economics for these 2 sessions, and this is an important topic, one that Christians sometimes say, oh, that's not a moral issue, or that's not ethical, it's economics, we don't need to know it. But the truth of the matter is, economics is a moral and an ethical issue, and the Bible has a lot to say about economics. So I think it's important that we understand it as Christians and as citizens as well. I will suggest to everybody that you mute your microphones if they're not muted. Just so everybody knows, you can hear me, but I can't hear you. But Stephen is here running technology for us, and he has earphones on, so he can hear. If you have an important question, you can unmute and fire that off. Everybody, including Stephen, will hear it, and then Stephen will pass it on to me. We'll try to leave a little time at the end for some Q&A as well. Also, other important information that you may need to know, we did one of these classes about 4 weeks ago with some lower end equipment. It was hard for everyone to hear, and so we resolved to improve our equipment. We did that last session, and we had good reviews on all of that. The equipment we're using is borrowed from a local church. They're not using it right now. So one thing we may want to do is to raise the funds to have our own equipment to do this. But we will thank the Lord for the local church who gave us all this equipment. Well, let's do a little review of the last class. In starting with economics, we start off first of all with a concept that economics is an ethical issue. It's a moral issue, how we spend our money. We introduced a number of terms, and I'm going to share my screen here and just put some PowerPoint slides, and we'll roll through some quick review of some of the terms we talked about last time. Key economic terms, we talked about micro versus macroeconomics. Microeconomics is the study of the economics of a household or a single business or a single firm. Macroeconomics is the bigger picture. That is the study of economics as a whole society. That's macro. And what's interesting is the principles of economics are the same in the micro world as they are for the macro world. For example, your household, if there were tough economic times, very few households would think that you could spend yourselves rich. We know if times are tough economically for your household, maybe income is cut off or reduced, that you need to cut expenses. And in a microeconomic world, piling up debt is going to have a long-term negative consequence. But somehow people think in the macro world for a whole economy that the principles are different. People think, oh, times are tough, we can spend our way to prosperity. And folks, it just cannot happen. What is true at the micro level is also true at the macro level. We also introduced the term of capital. Capital is one of the core terms in the economic realm that we have to understand. And we define capital 2 ways. It is the means of production. It's how we produce or get production. Capital is also excess production. So whenever you have excess production, that is, you produce more than you need, it allows you to invest in more capital. And if you're having trouble with the term of capital, let's just use a common word for it. Think of capital as tools. So to the building contractor, his capital is a hammer, nails, saw, his pickup truck, his backhoe. That's capital for the building contractor. If you're a computer programmer, your capital might be programming books, it might be a computer, it might be language or development software. Those are the tools of the trade. And capital is the key thing to promoting prosperity and wealth. We find that prosperous nations have more capital and poor nations have less capital. Now there's a chicken and the egg question here as to which comes first. And the answer is that it's a bit of a cycle, but we really need capital to come first. And poor nations are generally poor because they don't have as much capital. Because as we have more tools, we can produce more and we have more wealth. So capital is a key economic concept. We talked about standard of living. Sometimes in the Christian world, we tend to put wealth or standard of living down. And certainly the Bible would not have us be enamored with wealth. We shouldn't seek after a lot of wealth. We shouldn't worship it. It's easy for material things and wealth to become an idol. But the Bible is not opposed to material things. We are told to produce. We're told to work. We're told to have a work ethic. And there's a variety of reasons for that. We're told to produce and work so that we have enough to feed our own families. We're told to produce and work so that we have savings for difficult times. We're told to work and produce so we have extra to take care of the poor. And we're told to work and produce so we can leave an inheritance to our grandchildren. So money is not evil. The Bible never says that. The love of money is what is evil. And there's a significant difference between money and the love of money. So as long as we don't love a standard of living, as long as we don't worship it, we should seek it. And time permitting, I could give you a lot of Bible passages telling us how we should be producing. We should be productive. So we should be worried about our standard of living. We should try to improve it. The more wealth we have, the more we can fund missions. The more wealth we have, the more diseases we can cure, the more medical research we have, all things that would be pleasing to God, especially if we can give him glory in achieving those things. Then we talked about exchange, or what we call trade. And I will use those two terms interchangeably. Sometimes I'll say trade, sometimes I'll say exchange. But exchange or trade is the voluntary act of giving something to someone else and getting something in exchange. A little earlier today, I went to get a green tea, and I went down to a local coffee shop. And I traded them some little green pieces of paper in my wallet for this cup of tea. It was a voluntary trade. It was not forced. They would rather have my money than the tea bags and the hot water. At that point in time, I would rather have the tea bags and the hot water than the money. We had a voluntary exchange or a trade. And we learned this on the tropical island last week. If you weren't here with us last week, we started with a small economy where it was just Mike Winther on the island. I had no one to trade with or exchange with. I was producing, I was trying to catch fish. And we discovered that I had technology because I invented a spear. And that spear enabled me to catch more fish. Well, the spear, what was it in economic terms? The spear was a tool. And therefore, the spear was what? It was capital. And on my island, the more capital I developed, the higher my standard of living. But then after a while, we had someone join me on the island. It might have been Stephen, I don't recall. Someone else who washes ashore. And now there's two of us in the island. Well, we both don't fish. We have a division of labor. I fish, and Stephen picked coconuts and things off the trees. And then we had a voluntary exchange or a trade. By doing that, we doubled our standard of living. Because when I was in the island myself, I had one food group to consume. I had fish. When Stephen came and we traded, now we both had two food groups. We had coconut and fish. So we doubled our standard of living. Why? Because we had a division of labor. I did some things, Stephen did others, and we had trade or exchange. Now, if Stephen and I did not trade or exchange on the island, his diet would be only coconuts, and my diet would be only fish. So we improve our standard of living with that trade or that exchange. And then specialization. Specialization exists because of trade. We can't trade unless there's specialization. If Stephen was fishing and I was fishing, there'd be no reason for me to trade my fish for his fish. The only reason to trade is if he has something different than what I have. And so specialization allows Stephen to become the expert in picking coconuts and climbing trees. I become the expert in catching fish, and we trade. And the end result is he focuses his time on coconuts. I focus my time on fish. We both become experts. Now, these are pretty simple elementary concepts. It shouldn't be hard for you to think about the bigger picture of this. The heart surgeon would not be a very good heart surgeon if he had to spend his day growing all the food for his family. He wouldn't be a very good heart surgeon if he had to spend his day building his own house. He wouldn't have enough time. He'd be spending all his time farming and not very much time practicing heart surgery. The reason why he's a specialist, the reason why he gets good at heart surgery is because someone else will grow food and trade their food for him for heart surgery. So specialization gives us lots of benefits in society. It gives us the welder, the blacksmith, the farmer, the doctor, all these specialized professions. I want to focus on productivity for a moment. There's a great book that I highly recommend called Biblical Economics. It's written by R.C. Sproul Jr. It is in our bookstore. It is available for purchase through IPS. At least I hope it is. We were out of it for a while, but if we are out of it, we'll work on getting more. But R.C. Sproul Jr. says this in Biblical Economics. He says, productivity is more than an abstract word used by demanding executives and scientists. It goes beyond pragmatic growth programs and material welfare. Productivity is a spiritual and ethical obligation. We are called to be productive by God. God commands that we bear fruit and that our work be worthwhile. Paul's exhortation that those who do not work shall not eat in 2 Thessalonians 3:10 illustrates our obligation to produce. We must bear fruit so our hungry will be fed and our nation may be blessed with prosperity. Fellow believers, Christians, we have an obligation to be productive, to bear fruit. And the economic concepts we're teaching here and the way our government handles the economy has a big impact on our productivity. We talked also about the functions of money on our island. Initially, Stephen and I and the other people that joined us on the island were bartering. Remember, barter is trading one good for a service without money. And we realized that bartering became complicated and complex when you start to get 5 or 10 households on an island. So we developed money. Now, what I didn't outline for you as clearly last time, I want to throw here that money performs at least 3 key functions. Now, some economists will identify a 4th and a 5th, but let me focus on these key functions. First function of money, it's a medium of exchange. It improves the efficiency of our trade because we don't have to barter for everything. Secondly, it is a store of value. So if I produce extra and I want to save, I can save my excess production in the form of money. Why do we want to store value? Why do we want to store production? Well, I may want to store production so I can take a vacation for 2 weeks and I can still eat while I'm on vacation. I may want to store value for my retirement years so I have something to live on when I'm older or feeble and can't work. And so store of value is important. Right now in this COVID crisis, why is the government having to give all these bailouts and all these financial handouts? It's because Americans don't have value stored. We don't have savings. And I've written on this elsewhere, but there's reasons why our government policy has discouraged savings. But money allows you a way to store value. So money is a medium of exchange to trade more easily. It stores value. Third, it is a measurement of value. It's how we know that 1 hour of the heart surgeon's time might be worth 20 hours of lawn mowing time. And how do we know that? Because a surgeon makes 20 times more per hour than the guy that mows lawns. We need to have a way of comparing value in society, and that's okay. Not everyone's time has equal value. The heart surgeon invested 10 or 15 years in medical school and training. It makes sense for all that training that the heart surgeon's time might be more valuable. To train to mow lawns for a living may only take a few weeks. So we as a society need to measure value, and money lets us do this. Money is so important, though, because we can steal from people if we manipulate the money. And we had our scriptural verse last time from Proverbs 11:1. It said, the Lord abhors dishonest scales, but accurate weights are his delight. Money is a scale. Money is a weight. It's how we weigh the value in exchange. It's how we weigh the value of something stored. It's how we compare one thing to another. And if we tamper with the money, then what we're doing is we're tampering with the scales. Just like the unfaithful merchant who lies about the weight of the grain scale, and his weight says 1 pound, but it's only 8 ounces. And so he sells someone wheat, and it looks like it weighs 1 pound, but it only weighs 8 ounces. So this is an important consideration. The qualities of money, which we explored a little bit last time, because money cannot perform its functions if it doesn't have these qualities. Let me back up a slide. These were the functions of money: medium of exchange, store of value, measurement of value. Here are the qualities of money. These qualities are necessary for money to perform its functions. So good money needs scarcity. How do we violate that on the island? Well, when we were using little seashells for money, we discovered it wasn't scarce. And when one person on the island found a beach with a lot of these seashells, that person was able to inflate the money supply. That means increase. And the person that found all the free money, all the free seashells, that person was able to stop working, but still able to consume. And so we transferred wealth from the workers of the island to the one that had the money. That's what inflation does. So good money should be scarce. Good money also should be durable. Money doesn't work well if we make fish into money. Why? I can't have a store of value with that, right? The fish spoils. It goes bad, so it's not durable. Good money should be divisible, so we can have varying measurements of it. A cow is not good money because it's hard to exchange 1/3 of a cow or 1/100th of a cow. Hard to chop it up, because once you chop the cow up, it's no longer storable. Now it's meat you have to consume. Transportability. Good money should be transportable. And then intrinsic value. Good money should store value over time. And what we learned last time was that paper money in our wallet has pretty good durability. It has good divisibility. It has good transportability. It has the 3 middle traits. But the paper money that we use in America, or any paper money system, does not have scarcity, because the central bank or the government can print more anytime they want. And by the way, that's what we're doing right now. Over $3 trillion added to the money supply in the last 6 weeks. We're essentially, just like in the island, when someone found the extra seashells, we're inflating the money supply. And of course, paper doesn't have intrinsic value long term. Okay, and by the way, so the question there is, well, what is good money? Historically, societies for 4,000 years have discovered that the best money tends to be precious metals, gold and silver primarily, because they're scarce, they're durable, they're divisible, they're transportable, and they have intrinsic value. Okay, so now we're going to talk some new content today. I did a lot of review there, but I think I added some content in the review that is important. Hey, the cool thing is I got lots of slides. You guys don't have to look at me today. So, but for those who are dying to see this haircut that hasn't happened, I'll be back on the camera in a second. But we need now to talk about economic systems, and then we'll go back to the island and explore these economic systems. But there are really only 2 economic systems in the world. There's what we call the free market, and there's what we call socialism. So these are the 2 economic systems that any nation could have. Whether your nation's a dictator or democracy or an oligarchy, whatever form of government you have, it's going to have essentially a free market or socialism, or a blending of those 2 things. Our communist nations, people talk about communism. What is communism? Communism is just a form of socialism. So I don't have communism here because if you look at Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, what you'll discover is in his Communist Manifesto that Marx never advocates for communism. I have a copy here of the Communist Manifesto. It's not that long. Karl Marx wrote it in the 1800s. This is really the founding document for the Soviet Union and later on for Communist China. And Karl Marx, you'll discover in this document, never advocates for communism. He advocates for socialism. And he said a communist technically is just someone who wants socialism. So we need to define a little bit what socialism is in contrast to the free market. So let's do that. Let's go back to some slides and take a look at what traits define these systems. So by definition, economic systems. The free market is a system with essentially no government involvement in trade. On my slide, I say no government involvement. It's not a system of no government. Don't get it wrong. In a free market, the government still would prosecute the murderer, the bank robber, the rapist, but the government would not get involved in voluntary trade. So the free market is a system of voluntary actions. So people are free to buy, sell, and trade voluntarily without government interference. So on our tropical island, at the end of the day, when I wanted to trade fish for Stephen for his coconuts, as long as you're both in agreement, there is no reason why anyone should intervene. When we added the 10 families to our island, we had people growing berries, we had people doing carpentry, all these different skills. All trade was voluntary. That's why it became difficult when I wanted berries and I wanted to trade fish for berries, but the lady who grew the berries didn't want my fish. Well, I couldn't force her to trade, so I had to do this complicated barter where I had to trade for, I don't know how my example went, but I think I was trading my fish to Stephen for coconuts and coconuts for woodworking and woodworking for turkeys and turkeys for berries. I went through all of that to keep all the exchanges voluntary. By contrast, socialism is a system that does not rely on 100% voluntary trade. Socialism says that government gets involved in exchange or trade. And in socialism, you have some, oftentimes many, non-voluntary transactions. And we'll dice this out a little more carefully later. But the free market's more geared to the voluntary society. Socialism is more a controlled society where people are forced to do things they don't want to do. Let's drill down on this a little more. So we define free market as the voluntary exchange of goods and services unencumbered by government. To be encumbered means to be limited. So unencumbered means not limited. But government does enforce private contract. This is the idea of a civil court system. So our courts are enforcing private agreements. So if I have a trade with Stephen and I say, Stephen, you give me coconut today and I promise I'll give you fish tomorrow, and we shake on it. That's a contract. So if Stephen gives me a coconut today, tomorrow Stephen comes to me and says, okay, time to pay up the fish. And I say, no, I don't want to give you the fish. Now I have violated the contract. So if we had a government on the island, Stephen would go to the government, to the courts, and say, hey, we had a contract. Mike Winther violated the contract, and the courts would force me to honor that. Now these two things, the voluntary exchange and the enforcement of contract, has a biblical construct. On my slide here, I say, put another way, the two biblical principles are, number one, do no harm to others. And do no harm to others is parallel to voluntary exchange, because I'm not forcing someone to trade. I'm not stealing from them. I'm not using a gun to exchange. So I'm doing no harm to others. And the second quality is do all that you've said you do. What would the Bible teach us? Not to harm others and to honor your word. So if I make a contract, I honor my contract. So government's purpose is to not get in the way of the voluntary trade as long as I'm doing no harm to anyone, and it's to enforce contract. And as you can quickly determine, the nations in the modern world go way beyond this. Whether it be America or China or wherever, our governments say, no, you can't have voluntary trade. If I want to go to work for someone and agree to work for $6 an hour, the government says, no, you can't do that, even though it might be voluntary. Why does government say you can't do that? Because government has minimum wage laws. Or if I say I want to go to work for someone and I'll work all night, I'll work a 12-hour shift, and the government says, no, you can't do that because you have to be paid overtime. So the government gets involved in a lot of voluntary trade. And by the way, that did not used to be the case in America. America was built on voluntary trade and exchange. And it's only been in the last 80 or 90 years that we've begun to have government get involved in that. So in economic systems, socialism, we have two qualities that help us define socialism. We have socialism if you have government control of capital. Well, what is capital? Well, capital is our tools. Well, in some nations, does government try to control capital? Well, in a lot of nations, the government tries to own the capital. For example, airplanes or railroads and trains, are they capital? Yeah, they're tools of transportation to help us produce. So a train system is capital, just like an airport or a runway. So in a lot of nations, we have the government owning the transportation infrastructure. Well, if the government owns or controls the transportation infrastructure, they have socialized those tools. They have socialized that part of the capitalist economy. Now, we don't have government owning our hammers yet, but we do have government controlling our land. By the way, is land capital? Yes, it is. It's a tool. The farmer needs land upon which to grow the crops. The soil is part of the tools that they use. Well, if a farmer owns land and the farmer wants to build a barn, and a barn is capital because it's a tool, it helps him protect his equipment or store his wheat or store his hay for his cows, the barn is capital. Well, in America, the government says, yes, you can own land and you can own the barn, but you cannot build the barn without a government permit. Now we have government controlling the capital. So to the extent that government controls the capital, you have some degree of socialism. Now, I want to make sure here that people understand that there's kind of a scale or a continuum. It'd be nice if modern economies were 100% socialism or 100% free market. That's not the case. I don't know of any nation in the world that would hold a biblical model of being 100% free market. And frankly, I don't know any nation that would hold a 100% Marxist model of 100% socialism. What we have is a scale where some nations are a little more free market, maybe a lot of free market, and a little socialism. Some are like half free market and half socialism, and others are like 90% socialism and 10% free market. There's a scale. And what we'll discover as we go through our economics, hopefully today, that the more you move towards socialism, the more you reduce productivity and the more you cause poverty. So socialism, you can identify it if there's government control of capital, number one. You can also identify it if there's forced redistribution of wealth. Now keep in mind, to the economist, the word wealth has a different meaning. The homeless person pushing a shopping cart has wealth. Wealth is defined as any asset that you own. So the homeless person has assets. What do they have? They have the clothes in their back, they've got their shopping cart, they may have the leash for their dog, plastic bags to put their bottles and cans in. So socialism is the forced redistribution of wealth or assets. Do we do that? Yeah, in America, we do that a lot. We take from one group and give to another. We say this group needs health care. We forcibly take away from some to give to others. We do that with food, housing. It happens in China, it happens in England, it happens in France, it happens in America. It's that forced redistribution of wealth. By the way, Karl Marx has an expression, and if you're not familiar with Karl Marx, he's the one that wrote the Communist Manifesto that I held up a bit ago. He's the father of modern communism. Keep in mind, communism and socialism were not invented in the 1800s. It goes back before Christ, actually. But Karl Marx created the modern blueprint for socialism and communism. And Marx has this slogan. His slogan is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So implied in this is the idea that some have more ability, have more assets, others have less. So socialism is taking from those that have more and giving to those that have less. Now, to a lot of Christians, this may seem like a very biblical expression. We're told to help those in need. We're told to, if I have two coats and my neighbor has one, we're told to share a coat with a neighbor. So what Marx advocates in socialism sounds like Christianity, but be very careful, folks, it's not. What you'll discover is that, I'll end my share here for just a second. What you'll discover is that Satan likes to take truth and just twist it a little bit. You know, in the Garden of Eden, when the serpent approached Eve, the serpent did not tell all lies to Eve. The serpent told Eve a lot of truth mixed with some lies. And Satan knows that his lies are more effective if you mix them with truth. So what Satan likes to do is get close to the truth, but to pollute that with his lie. Well, Karl Marx, and I'm not saying that Satan worked through Marx, but he might have, that Karl Marx takes the truth of Christianity but just pollutes it a little bit. Because the Christian worldview says that we help those in need, but we do it voluntarily. You see, the heart is the key of Christianity, right? We do things voluntarily. Karl Marx is not advocating in socialism that it's voluntary. In socialism, it is the forced redistribution. So in socialism, it's the government saying, you have 2 coats, your neighbor has none, you have to give 1 coat to your neighbor. So let me make sure you're clear on that. The difference between Christian charity and socialism is that socialism is forced. Christian charity is voluntary. Now, the goal may seem similar. It seems very appealing to help those in need. But the truth of the matter is that if you try to do a Christ-like or godly thing, but if you don't do it in a Christ-like way, God is not blessed. For example, there could be a mission overseas, an orphanage that needs money. The kids need food. And you think, man, I want to help this. And they're starving children. God would want us to feed the starving children. But I don't have enough money to give the orphanage what I want. So I go down to the bank and I can get my ski mask, or nowadays I get my COVID surgical mask and a gun and a note. And I go to the teller with my gun, show her my gun and say, put all the money you have in the bag. And I could rob the bank. And I could walk out, I could take all that money and send it to the orphanage in the third world. Would God have us do that? Is the goal to feed the orphans? Well, I think if you have any idea of Christian ethics, you soon understand that, yes, we're to help the orphans, but we shouldn't sin and try to help the orphans through sin. God will never bless my effort to feed the orphans if I do it by stealing from the bank. By the way, what is the biblical command on stealing? It's the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. So God is concerned about the methodology or the methods. And so socialism and communism says we're going to take care of people by stealing to help the poor. And God will never bless that. And time permitting today, we're going to see and learn how actually when you do it Karl Marx's way instead of God's way, you don't get less poverty, you get more poverty. Folks, God is not mocked. You cannot serve the Lord by breaking his law. You cannot feed the poor by doing it in a way that contradicts God's law. So the heart of socialism is that it's government taking from one and giving to another. And a lot of people in the modern world say, well, that's what governments do. Governments are supposed to do that. Well, it's true, that's what governments do, but it's not what they're supposed to do. It breaks a lot of both Old Testament and New Testament guidelines for the powers of the civil magistrate. And we may do another session later on poverty and taking care of the poor, which I hope to do. We'll go into more depth on that. But let's explore a little more here on socialism that I think will be important to us. Let me share my screen again. And so Karl Marx is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, but everything he describes, and the motto of socialism is to do that by force, using government to distribute, not people's voluntary charity. So now, so socialism, as I described, is linked to redistribution of wealth or redistribution of assets. By the way, socialism is not always taking from the rich and giving to the poor. A lot of what we do in America is reversed. We have a lot of government programs that take from the poor and give to the rich. That's still socialism. So no matter which way it goes, it's forced redistribution of wealth. Alexis de Tocqueville, who you may or may not be familiar with, he was a Frenchman that came to America in the 1800s, and he was amazed at how prosperous and powerful America had become and the standard of living that we had. And he was a sociologist. He spent years studying America, writes a huge book of 4 huge volumes called Democracy in America. And he makes this observation because he's noticing how prosperous America was. But he says this, he says, but there exists also in the human heart a depraved taste for equality. By the way, depraved means evil or bad. A depraved taste for equality, which impels, that means compels or forces, which impels the weak to attempt to lower the powerful to their own level and reduces men to prefer equality in slavery to inequality with freedom. Now there's a lot there. Let me just read that one more time. But there exists also in the human heart a depraved taste for equality, which impels the weak to attempt to lower the powerful to their own level and reduces men to prefer equality in slavery to inequality with freedom. We see this in the modern world. We see people who lust for other people's money. By the way, this is covetousness. And we see people that would rather the whole nation be poor and equal than to have the whole nation be middle class and rich and unequal. Okay. Well, let's go back to our tropical island here. Let's do this. Let's stop our share here. So let's say we have our 10 families on our island and we have an economic system. We now have a currency. Maybe we've got some gold or silver. We're trading and buying and selling. Or we could still be in a barter economy. My example works either way. But somebody says, you know, we should be sharing everything in common. This idea of my property and your property, it just doesn't sound good. And maybe a couple people on our island were trained in a modern Western university and learned about Karl Marx and how great communism and socialism is. So our island decides to do an experiment in socialism. So we decide instead of having private property, we're going to own everything in common. So we all work at our specialization all day. At the end of the day, we take all of our production and we take it to the middle of the island, a little clearing there, and we put all our production there and we share equally. So let's say in the course of the day, I fish and I collect 10 units of fish. Maybe I work a 10-hour day. To make this real easy on the math, let's assume that each of us produces 1 unit of what we work at per hour. So if I fish for 10 hours, I have 10 units of fish. Stephen harvests coconuts for 10 hours, and he produces 10 units of coconut. Someone else produces berries for 10 hours, 10 units of berries. So we all work a 10-hour day. At the end of the day, we all put our produce in the middle of the island, and we all take out equally. I put in 10 units of fish. Maybe I take out 1 unit of coconut, 1 unit of fish, 1 unit of cabinetry or construction, 1 unit of berries, 1 unit of turkey, and we all take out. So I put in 10 units of production, and I take out 10 units of production. I put in all fish. I get back a variety of things. All is good. We have this system. We all trade. We all put in 10. We all get out 10. And our agreement is that we share equally. Now, for the sake of argument right now, I'm going to say that everybody works the same amount. We all work a 10-hour day. But as we do this system, it's a tropical island, and it's kind of hot in the middle of the day. Matter of fact, between 4 and 5 o'clock, it's really hot. So I'm going to pick on my associate, Stephen, here. Stephen is the smartest guy in the island. Stephen says, wow, what if I take a nap for an hour? So Stephen says, I'm just going to work 9 hours doing coconuts. So he takes a nap in the hottest part of the day, finds a piece of shade, takes a nap. At the end of the day, we all put our production on the island. We all put in 10 units, but Stephen only worked 9 hours. He puts in 9 units. Now, to make the math easy, let's assume we have 10 families working. So the total production of our island before Stephen took his nap on those good days was 100 units of production. Each family produces 10 families, 10 times 10 is 100. Okay, this is, I think, as hard as the math will get right there, okay? So we had 100 units of production to share. But now Stephen takes an hour off. He only puts 9 units of coconuts in. Now the rest of us put in our 10. So the total island production, we can call it the gross island product, has dropped from 100 units of production to what? Down to 99 units of production. So we all share equally, and that means we all take out no longer 10 items or 10 units, we all take out 9.9 units. So we are all 1/10 of a unit of production poorer than we were. Stephen takes out 9.9, I take out 9.9, Diana takes out 9.9, we all get 9.9. We are now economically less well off. We've all lost 1/10 of a unit of production. But what's cool is Stephen got the better deal because he got an hour's nap. So really, he only produced 9 units, but he got to take out 9.9. Do you guys see this? So Stephen is actually now taking advantage of everyone else on the island. Well, not to be outdone, after a while, Diana notices this, and Diana says, wow, Stephen's taking a nap. I could take a nap. So Diana takes a nap in the middle of the afternoon. So at the end of the day, she only puts in 9 units of production. So now what's our total island production? Well, 8 families each putting in 10. Diana putting in 9, Stephen putting in 9. Do the math, it's 98 units of production. At the end of the day, we all take out 9.8 units. Our island is getting poorer. But this was a good deal for Stephen. It's a good deal for Diana because she traded an hour of her time, but it only cost her 1/10 of an hour of production for her family. Cost her 1/10 of a unit. So it makes sense for Stephen to do this. Would you not give up 1 unit of your production to get 9/10 more back than what you produced? Because that's what socialism is. Socialism is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Well, eventually the rest of us on the island, we get tired of watching Stephen and Diana take a nap. So what do the rest of us do? Well, we all begin to take an hour off during the hot part of the day. So now no one's working a 10-hour day. We're all working 9 hours. What's the total production of our island now when everybody does that? Total production is only 90 units of production. We are moving towards poverty. Let me share my screen and show this graphically for you. So I've got this little chart here. On the left-hand column, it shows number of families. We have 10 families on our island. We start off with each family producing 10 units a day. I multiply 10 families times 10 units, 100 units produced. That's a total production of 100. So each family gets 10 units. So we all produce 10, we all get 10. That was before Stephen started taking his nap. By the way, Stephen just yawned. You guys can't see it, but I'm sure he feels a nap coming on. But now we change the situation. We now have 9 families producing 10 units for 90. But here's Stephen only producing 9 units. So in between the 2 solid lines, we've got the 9 families and Stephen's family. Everybody's producing 10 except Stephen. That's 90. He produces 9. There's our 99. So our production of the island went down by 1 unit, but it didn't cost Stephen 1 unit. He got 9.9. It only cost him 1/10 of a unit of production. So here now is what happens when Diana gets wise and she takes a nap. We have 8 families producing 10, 2 families producing 9. So that's 80 units for the 8 hardworking families. It's 18 units of production for the smart families taking a nap. That's 98. At the end of the day, we all share 9.8 items. 9.8 units, I guess you would say. So what happens, everybody wises up. Everybody wises up. Now we have 10 families only working 9 hours. Now there's only 90 units of production in the center of the island. Each family only gets 9 units. We are all now poorer. What's fascinating though, folks, is that everyone here is acting logically and rationally. It makes sense for Stephen to say, wow, I can trade an hour of hard work and it only costs me 1/10 of an hour of food and services and goods. That's a good trade. That makes sense. Now you can argue it may not be ethical, but it makes sense for Stephen if he can trade 1 hour of work and it only costs him 1/10 of an hour. When Diana joined in, she traded 1 hour of work, but now it cost her 2/10 of an hour because she only got 9.8 units. But it makes sense. It's the smart thing to do. And here's the problem. Socialism doesn't work to share things equally if you have intelligent people. Pure and simple. Now, let's extend this logic out. Stephen's still the smartest guy on the island. So everybody now is taking an hour off, but Stephen says, wow, that was productive for me to do that because I could trade an hour of time, it only cost me 1/10. I'm going to do that again. So now Stephen is going to take 2 hours off. So now we have 9 families working 9 hours, 1 family, Stephen's family working 8 hours. So now there's 89 units of production. Stephen at the end of the day gets 8.9 units, even though he only produced 8. He's getting more than he produced because we're sharing equally. And see, here's the problem with socialism. It has what we call a perverse incentive. It gives the wrong incentive. The people benefit the most who produce the least. And of course, what happens eventually? Well, everybody else says, wow, a 2-hour nap would be nice. We're going to do what Stephen does. And now there's 10 families only working 8 hours. And look what's happened. Our total productivity of the island has gone from 100 units down to 80 units. We can very quickly see where this would go. Pretty soon, people are only working 7-hour days and only 70 units of production. We are creating poverty through this very, very system. Now, it's interesting. I made the point that socialism doesn't work amongst people who are intelligent in doing cost-benefit analysis. But you could say, well, as Christians, though, we should work and we should produce, and you're right. If you know the founding of America very well, you know that of the first 2 settlements here, the second one was the one at Plymouth Plantation. The Plymouth colony were devout, Reformed Christians. They were Puritans. They were among the most devout Christians. By the way, if you've not read the Puritan writings, you should. There's probably no other group of writings that will call you to an obedience to the Lord, a love of the Lord, an appreciation of repentance and your salvation more than these Puritan authors. These Puritans come here, settle in Plymouth in Massachusetts in, did I say 1820 earlier? I meant 1620. And they were a hardworking group. What most people don't know is that they had investors that paid their way here. And the investors required them to have socialism. The contract their investors gave required them to own everything in common. They owned the seed in common, they owned the produce, the end result. And for the first 2 years, they were dying of starvation. They were hungry, there was not enough food. And so after 2 years, the elders got together and said, what can we do that we would not languish in misery? And Bradford, who was the governor of the colony, a sound Christian man who writes a firsthand account, his biography of the colony written by him is still published today. And Bradford said, we got to realizing we were running our economy based on the Greek philosopher Plato, because Karl Marx hadn't written the Socialist Communist Manifesto yet. But he says, we're following Plato in community or communal ownership, and we are disobeying God's commands for private property. And so they abrogated their contract with the investors and said, we're going to have private property. They gave every family a share of seed and said, you produce and you get all the produce that you produce. And guess what? People worked harder. They planted the seed more carefully. They watered more. They cultivated more. He describes how the women who normally weren't working before went with their young ones in the field to work. And the end result was that next fall, they had a bountiful harvest. First year of a bountiful harvest. Why? Because they went from community property ownership, where everybody owned everything in common. They went from our socialist island to a private island where people kept the fruit of their labor. They had so much production that they knew they had enough, more than enough, for the whole next year to live on. And because they were so prosperous, they invited the Indians to come. And they had a big feast that fall. And do you know what that feast is? That feast was the first Thanksgiving. That's the Thanksgiving feast we celebrate. And Christians sometimes don't know that the Thanksgiving feast that we celebrate today was a Christian holiday. It was the Pilgrims of Plymouth celebrating the bounty they got when they abandoned socialism and went to the free market. It was an abandonment of communal property and endorsement of private property. Christian, our God is a God of private property, not community or communal property. And I could spend an hour isolating all the scripture that demonstrates that, and maybe in a future time, we might do that. But the bottom line is, the Pilgrims said, wow, we realized we were following the Greek philosopher Plato. Plato taught the idea of a kingship, of a socialist economy, and the founding fathers of Plymouth said, oh, we need to abandon that. We need to go to a private free market economy where people keep their own produce. And guess what? The poor were better taken care of when they went to private property because people had more to share with those who were poor. So When you look at a lot of nations, China and the Soviet Union are still way more socialist than America. That's why their standard of living is lower. However, China has adopted a little bit of market principles. They've allowed people to own more of their own things. And as they allow people to own more of their own things, productivity goes up. Now, if I go back to my screen share here, go back to my little chart. And I notice the heading on this chart is called Motivational Loss. Socialism reduces people's motivation to work. So there's motivational loss. Now, let me go to one more island scenario here. I think we have time for it. Let's go back and say, okay, now we're going to abandon this system partially, but we realize the island, not everybody produces equally. Okay? So at, I know Stephen's preparing a note for me. It's okay, I'll get that in a minute. Let's say on our island that we have people who are more productive. They produce more than others. So you have rich people and poor people on the island. So what if we're going to use socialism now to try to take care of the poor? Well, when we start redistributing wealth, we're going to have the same motivational loss. But now if we're going to not distribute equally, we're going to give more to the poor. We're going to take more from the rich and give to the poor. We now have to have a system for doing that. Because let's say our island policy starts off, we're going to take the richest family on the island, we're just going to tax them to give to the poorest family. That's the only exchange we're going to do, from richest to poorest. Well, everybody doesn't, or let me reverse that. Nobody wants to be the richest family, right? So how do you know who the richest family is? Well, we have to have someone who's a tax collector. We have to have someone who oversees the production of all of these families. So we know who the rich family is. It has to give up something for the poor family. Oh, and by the way, a lot of families want to be the poor family. They want free stuff. They might lie and cheat about how much they have. So we need a social worker to audit and decide who the poorest family is. So to make this work, we have to take someone on our island. Let's assume we have 10 families. We're going to take the wage earner from one of those families, and we're going to make them the tax collector and the social worker, and they're going to watch everyone's production and audit so we know who the richest person is, so we can take from them and give to the poorest person. Well, this is called distributional loss. Go back to my chart. We start with 10 families producing 10 units a day, and we have no families redistributing. Everybody's producing 100 units produced, 10 per family on average. But now we say, well, we need to redistribute. So we're going to take one family and we're going to make them the tax collector and the social worker. So maybe this is the family that was producing turkeys and fowl. Well, now they're the auditor, the tax collector, the social worker. So they're no longer producing. They spend their days working on the redistribution. So now we have 9 families producing 10 units a day, 1 family redistributing, producing nothing. What happened to our total production on the island? It went down from 90 units of production. It went down from 100 to 90. There's less per family. So now, yeah, we're feeding the poor family, but everybody has less. Now, what were to happen if instead of 1 person redistributing, we had 2, 3, or 4? You can see very quickly, look at the total production. What if we took 40% of our island, had them busy redistributing wealth? Our total production on the island would go from 100 units down to 60. Now we've made more people poor with our redistribution. Now you say, yeah, but you would never use 40% of your island's productive capacity to redistribute. Do you know what we use in America? By many estimates, in most stages of our economy, almost 40% of our workforce is engaged in the redistribution of wealth in our socialist system. You realize those people in the redistributing are no longer producing anything. So the total number of goods and services goes down. That's less for everyone to have. And by the way, when the goods and services goes down, that reduces supply. What happens to price? As supply goes down, price goes up. Fewer people producing food, fewer people producing cars, fewer people producing various services. We have less of those services. That drives the price up. Who is hurt most by that price increase? Poor families, right? So what we've done by our distributional loss to our economy is we have raised the price of goods and services for poor people and made less food available for them. Now, this little chart here I have only assumes the distributional loss. What if we combine the motivational loss that I had in my first chart here, and I combine it with the distributional loss? You see that we have a huge hit to our economy. So there's two kinds of distributional loss, by the way. We lose the producers, those people who become social workers or nonprofit redistributors or government grant makers, or those people that work for the IRS collecting money. They're no longer producing their good and service. So we have that loss, but also the recipients who now get that are less motivated to work. And so we reduce the incentive for them to work as well. So economic losses from socialism, we lose motivation and we lose the distributional loss. And this is why the more socialism you do, the more poverty you get. So if you have people that need food and we redistribute from rich or whatever to poor to provide food, now there's people that are on the margin. There were people who were just getting by before, but now the redistribution makes them become poor. So yes, we feed people who couldn't have food, but now there's people before that could afford housing, and now they can't afford housing. And then we start a housing program. Well, now the housing program puts a tax burden on part of your population. So now people who could afford healthcare before now can't afford healthcare. So now we need a government healthcare program. So each program you do to help the lower end of the economic scale hurts people in the middle and the upper end and drives more people to poverty. And it does it because of motivational loss, and it does it because of distributional loss. I was at a conference a number of years ago with a fellow who's a PhD economist at a major university. And he was not a Christian, but we were discussing poverty. And he said, you know, for 50 years, our PhDs in economics have been doing studies, economic journals have been studying poverty. And he says, we've debated the causes of poverty, we have debated the solutions to poverty. But he says, really, for most of the academic community, he says, the debate is now over. We know the cause of poverty. The cause of poverty are anti-poverty programs. He says they cause more poverty than they solve. And why? Because of motivational loss and distributional loss. And the bottom line, folks, here is that if we use the government to forcibly take from one and give to another, that is stealing. It would be stealing if I did it, and it's therefore stealing if the government does it. We're not doing it God's way. God says we take care of the poor by voluntary means, not by forced or compulsory means. By the way, it's interesting, that motivational loss that you see, when people give voluntarily to charity, there's no motivational loss. People who are wealthy, who have a high tax rate, are motivated not to make as much. And I don't know if you know this, I know people who are very productive, good at what they do, they're making high incomes, and they scale back their hours because their tax rate is so high. That's not what we want to do. We don't want to punish the most productive people by taxing them more and giving them an incentive to stop producing. I have a relative who's a Silicon Valley engineer, a lot of patents to his name, a highly productive engineer, and he got to the point when he was about 52, 53, he scaled back his work to only about half time. And the reason why was he was giving up 60% of what he made in taxes. He would have worked more if he could have kept more. So the problem is we reduce the incentive for people to work with a socialist system. But when people can voluntarily give, it actually motivates them to work more. If people enjoy giving voluntarily and help the poor, they're motivated to, wow, I love helping the poor, I love doing this, especially if you're a Christian. But even for the non-Christian, this is true. People are motivated to work more. So when you have voluntary charity, you do not have the motivational loss. But when you have forced charity, which isn't charity at all, you do have the motivational loss. All the more reason why we should follow God's pattern of doing it voluntarily. Okay. Now, lots more we could do here, but I think this gives you an overview of the two economic systems. Folks, we need to understand that there's many causes to poverty. I mean, poverty can be attributed to spiritual reasons, to political reasons, to economic reasons. But the main reasons why poverty exists is people don't have as many tools or as much capital. Poverty exists because we redistribute wealth. Poverty exists because we don't have good, solid rights to private property. These are the main reasons poverty exists. You know, you compare North America to Africa. North America has a very high standard of living. Most nations of Africa have a very poor standard of living. Why are people in Africa poor? Well, there was a time people thought, oh, it's because of the race. You know, maybe they're not as smart or not as productive. Well, we know now that's not the case at all. We know that Africans are just as smart, just as able as anybody who's Anglo-Saxon or Asian or whatever. So it's not race. Then they said, well, people in Africa are poor because they lack natural resources. Maybe they don't have the coal and the oil and the molybdenum and the chrome and the copper and the iron in the ground. Well, come to find out, per square mile, Africa has more of all those resources than North America, in every one of them. So the reason people in Africa are poor, it's not genetic, and it's not because they lack natural resources. They're poor because their governments make them poor. And their governments make them poor because they don't have rights to private property, and it makes it hard to accumulate capital. The governments overtax, so people aren't motivated. The governments have more socialism, they're redistributing wealth, and there's not a legal system that protects private property. This is why poor nations are poor. It is government policies, bad government policies, that make people poor. And the truth of the matter is, governments cannot make a people rich, at least not directly. Governments can make people rich by allowing the free market to operate. That's when you get wealth. So the government does not create wealth by what it does. The government creates wealth by what it doesn't do. If it lets the market alone, wealth is created. Okay, we have about 15 minutes left. And boy, there's always tons of additional material we could do. Oh, let me make one plug and then we'll go to the questions and answers. There is a book that we have. Now, some of the content I'm teaching comes out of our 20-hour course called Biblical Principles of Government. And along with that course, we have a study guide or a book. And it's a book that is, 199 pages long. It does not contain all of the principles of our class, but it contains a lot of them. And this is a $25 book, a lot of content here. But if you want to go into more depth and get more support and cover a lot of things beyond what we're covering here, there's some great historical stories here to support some of the concepts. That book is $25. It's available on our website. There's shipping and handling and sales tax. But I encourage you to look at the biblical principles of government. You can find it on our store and our website or call our office. Our office phone number is 209-575-2005. So did I say that right? 209-575-2005. 2005 was the year we were founded. That's the last 4 digits of our phone number. Okay, I'm open to questions. You can either type them and Stephen will give them to me, or you can speak them. And Stephen, do we have any questions stocked up? Okay.
First question is, what is libertarian/anarchist?
Okay. Question is about the terms libertarian, anarchist, and maybe socialism. Okay. First of all, keep in mind with any term, different people will define some terms differently. Anarchy, let's take that one first. Anarchism or an anarchist, the same as the one's anarchy is the absence of civil government. Now, you may recall, if you were with us for the very first class weeks ago, I talked about the 3 God-ordained governments. There's family government, church government, and civil government. Civil government is what we would call the state. That's our city, county, state, federal governments. Anarchy would be having no civil government. I'm a small government advocate, but I don't believe in no government. I believe the Bible says that there's a proper role for the civil magistrate and for civil government. So I would not support anarchy. But what happens is, because our governments have gotten too big, some people overreact by saying, gee, because we have too much government, we should go to no government. And to me, that's jumping from the frying pan into the fire. So I think there's a proper role for government, and I don't have time to outline why that is, but I would oppose anarchy. Now, the term libertarian came up. Different people put different meanings into libertarian. There's 2 branches of libertarianism. There's atheist libertarianism, and there's Christian libertarianism. They agree on a lot of things, but they disagree on a few. The atheist libertarian would say there is no God, and therefore their libertarianism is just based on, let's create a system that we think works better. And libertarian has the root word of liberty. So a libertarian is someone that puts a high value on freedom and wants a small government. So the Christian libertarian and the atheist libertarian would agree on 75% of things, but the Christian libertarian would disagree on some parts because the biblical model of what the civil state should do. Generally, libertarians don't go all the way to anarchy. If there's a continuation or a scale, you might have totalitarianism on one end, which is total government control, and you get moderate government, and then libertarianism, which would be very small government, and then going further would be anarchy, which is no government.
What happens when the majority of people are not believers, and those who are believers still do not give to the poor? Then God is not pleased again.
Okay, the question is, what happens when the majority of people are not believers, or the believers don't give, and God is not pleased again? Well, a couple answers. Number one, if you got rid of all the government welfare programs, the socialist programs. Now, to be clear, you could not eliminate these programs overnight. Okay, these programs came about little by little, step by step. You would create chaos if you abolished them overnight. But if you rolled them back gradually, what you would discover is even if no one gave to the poor, no Christians gave, no non-Christians, you would reduce poverty by 90%. Because my estimation is that 90% of poverty in America is caused by these anti-poverty programs. So right there, even if nobody gave, you would have less poverty. Now, clearly, it is the job of the church to give. And I think even non-Christians would give. The church gives a lot to poverty already. The problem is, as a church, we're giving to help the poor. While we're giving to help the poor, the government is creating poverty 5 times faster than we're giving to solve it. I'm convinced that if we gradually moved to a biblical model away from socialism, that we'd have less government-caused poverty, and the church would find it much easier to meet the needs of the poor. Matter of fact, the giving the church is doing right now is easily covering 25, 30% of all poverty. So if we eliminate these government programs slowly over time and got to a point where we were at a constitutional government without these programs, we would find the current level of church giving is more than we need.
Is education and skills considered capital or a tool?
Okay, the question is, are education skills considered capital or a tool? Well, actually, I would say that capital and tools are the same, okay, one and the same. So the question is an education or skill, is that capital? And economists will debate this. So this is one of those fine points where people in the profession split hairs over little things. I would say in general, though, that the answer is, in my view, yes. So if I learn to be a welder and I invest 6 months in going to welding school and learning that skill is capital to me. So I would argue it is. Some economists would say, no, technically it's not, and they'd create a different category for it. But I think it is. And so, for example, for me to go to welding school for 6 months to gain that capital, that means I need excess production somewhere because I have to be able to eat and pay the rent while I go to welding school. So I can't acquire that technical or educational capital unless there's savings somewhere. So if I've worked and saved, now I can live while I go to welding school to better myself. Or maybe my parents have savings and they help pay the way to school. So the short answer is, yeah, I would say those are capital, but be aware that some economists would split hairs and branch technology or head knowledge or skill into a different category.
Was the Jewish economic market or socialism model?
Okay, the question is, was or is Jewish economics closer to a socialism model or free market? If you look at the Old Testament world, it depends on the time period. It's a fascinating study of the Old Testament if you look at the various time periods. There were periods where there was much more of a free market model. There are periods of decentralized government power, but then there are periods in the Old Testament of more centralized government power. So history of the Jewish people, or the nation of Israel, shows us a mixture of both, back and forth. I don't know that you can point to too much of history that really demonstrates the ideal. There's a period of time during the Judges, before Israel had its first king. This would be before Samuel instilled Saul, where you had a decentralized system of government, far more prosperity, far more freedom, and frankly, far more righteousness. People misunderstand the period of the Judges because in the book of the Judges, it says there were periods of unrighteousness where everyone did what was right in his own eyes. But if you look at the time periods in Judges, and they're all outlined there, we know how many years each period was, you'll find there was more time of righteousness during the Judges than there was of unrighteousness. And at some point, you should either do, or we could do as a group, a study of 1 Samuel chapter 8, where God basically says he wants decentralized government, but the people of Israel want a centralized government. They want a king, and God says, that's not my best for you, but he gave them the king because they asked for it. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I don't think you can point to Israel, either ancient or current, as any sort of a model, except for a few windows of time during the period of the Judges.
Last week you mentioned that the Bible set out a specific tax rate. Would you share that with us?
Yeah. This actually goes back to the passage that I just mentioned. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, they had lived under a period of the Judges, and the people come to Samuel, who was the prophet. That was his office, was his prophet. And they said, we want a king. And it displeased Samuel that they wanted a king. And Samuel went to the Lord, and the Lord says, yeah, I'm displeased as well. God tells Samuel, go back to the people and tell them if they pursue getting a king, here are the evil things that are going to happen. And there's a list of I guess you'd call them curses or negative consequences. And among those negative consequences was that the king was going to tax the people at 10%. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters for a couple reasons. One is we know 10% was a curse. So we know that people were not paying a 10% tax rate up to that point. They're paying less than 10%. But if you think about it, if you're a Christian of any length of time, you can probably say, gee, there's something magic about that number 10%. Where does that number come from? And what is 10% to us as Christians? Somebody can just click your mic and shout out an answer. Steve will tell me if somebody tells you what 10% is.
Tithe.
It's a tithe.
It's the tithe, right? Well, the tithe is our tribute to God. And God asked for 10%. And it was considered idolatry for any leader or ruler to tax more than God asks. So the idea was that we'd pay 10% to God. The civil magistrate should never collect more than 9%. And the founding fathers in America had the mindset that it was unbiblical for any civil government to take more than 9%. Because to be 10% is the government making itself equal to God. And that was one of the curses that God said to Samuel to give to the people. Another curse was a military draft, which is a concept demonstrating that the ideal is an all-volunteer military. So the perfect civil government would tax 9% or less. And people say, well, gee, by the way, if you don't know how much tax you're paying now, join the club. Our tax system in America is complex enough, you can't know what you're paying because your taxes are not just the deductions out of your paycheck. Your taxes are built into everything you do. There's property taxes, there's tax on your phone bill, taxes on your utility bill. The gas in California is more than $1.10 per gallon in tax. The bread in the store has tax built into it. So we don't even know how much tax we pay. But most economists have estimated that the average family of four making $60,000 to $80,000 a year is paying about 55% of their income in taxes, both hidden and direct. Can you imagine? Over 50% in tax. I mean, when God says 10% is an abomination. And by the way, when it comes to Christians giving to the poor, How much more could we support missions and give to the poor if we were paying 9% tax instead of 50 or 55%?
How do Christian businesses survive in God's way without taking a loan from the government or banks in this pandemic?
Okay, this is a great question. How do Christian businesses try to do it God's way and survive in this environment? How do they survive without taking a loan in this pandemic? And the answer is, it may be hard to. There is a commentary on our website about why these loans become necessary. You may want to look at that. We're creating on our IPS website, and it's just under construction, but we're creating a series of articles and videos relating to the pandemic. I think right now there's 2 articles and 2 videos. We're hoping to add a couple every week to fill this up. But there's one there right now that talks about why it's necessary for the government to have to help everybody. And that's because our government policies in the past have discouraged savings. So that's one thing to look at. But I'll say this, if you are a small business person trying to save your business, is it ideal that we take a handout from the government? No, it's not ideal. But we are not in an era where we can live the ideal life right now. So if you need to, I would say, take it to keep the business afloat. But as you're taking it, recognize that this is an unconstitutional program, number one, and it's not ideal. And we need to be educating our children and our neighbors so we can move society gradually from where we are toward an ideal. Sometimes people talk about IPS's teaching and say, well, you're just in an idealistic world. You're teaching the ideal, not what's practical. And to the Christian, I would say, the Christian walk is about pursuing the ideal. We're supposed to be pursuing what is true and just and righteous. We pursue that in our families, we pursue it in our churches, and we should pursue it in our civil government. And in history, there have been times there have been more righteous government and less righteous government, and governments become more righteous when people know the truth and work towards it. So even if we can't live the ideal, we should be working towards it, educating towards it. And watch that COVID-19 section on our website. Lord willing, at least one new article a week is going to show up there dealing with different aspects of the crisis, because that's a really good question.
Is equality without forced redistribution, what the Bible advocates in 2 Corinthians 8:15, where it says, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little.
Okay, the question is about equality in the passage, and I forget where is it, Corinthians? 2 Corinthians. To be honest, I don't have my Bible in front of me, and I'm not intimately familiar with that passage, so let me not address that passage. I'm not sure that's what that passage is necessarily getting at as far as the concept of equality. But there are 3 kinds of equality. We do have an article, just a 2-page article on our website on that. There is equality of outcome. To have equality of outcome, we have to take from everybody has more and give to everybody has less until everybody's equal. That requires forced redistribution of wealth. That's bad. It takes away motivation. It creates poverty. The second kind of equality is equality of opportunity. That's better. That just means we don't force the outcome. We give everyone the same opportunity. But even equality of opportunity requires some socialism, because that means you've got to give everyone an equal education so they have equal opportunity. The third kind of opportunity, I'm sorry, say that again. The third kind of equality, which is the biblical form of equality, is equality under the law. That means we're not equal, and we won't have equal outcome, and we will not have equal opportunity necessarily, but the law treats everyone equally. You see, in socialism, the law treats everyone unequally. In socialism, you tax one person 55%, and the other person pays no tax and gets free money. Okay, that's inequality. Socialism is the heart of treating people unequal. A true government, a good government, is not biased. The Bible says God's not a respecter of persons, and he tells judges to judge rightly, to judge blindfolded, so you're not judging people based on their wealth, you're judging people on the law, on the facts. So we should have equality under the law, where our laws treat all the citizens equally. So we should not seek equality of outcome. We should not even seek equality of opportunity, but we should seek equality under the law. Only the free market gives you equality under the law. Socialism, by definition, is unequal law, where the law treats people differently. And that's a really good point to end on. Can I just emphasize that point? Socialism requires that government treat people differently under the law. Only a government allowing a free market can apply the same laws to everyone equally. So I'll leave you with that thought. Now, before I pray and close this, there's thought, James and I were talking about maybe extending this. James and I will talk later today or tomorrow probably about maybe doing another session. We're open to requests. A couple things I would encourage. Our ministry has costs, and so we do this for free, and we're happy to. But if you're able to give, we'd appreciate people giving to IPS. As you can imagine, some of our donors are out of work and not able to give. It puts some pressure on our finances. The equipment that we're using to make this possible is borrowed equipment. We would love to purchase some better equipment just like this for our own use. So no pressure. Some of you may not be able to give, and that's fine. But for those who can give, you can call our phone number. You can go to our website. There's a place to give. Consider getting the Biblical Principles of Government study guide that I talked about. Consider that. Check our website out. And Stephen has another question or comment, I think.
Well, James wanted you to comment how COVID has impacted IPS, which you kind of mentioned. And a lot of people are asking, is this going to be recorded and shared? A lot of people want to watch this as well as the previous.
Yeah, okay. So question about this being recorded and shared. And I believe we have hit the record button on Zoom on these. So we do have these recorded. So we will make them available. The method of doing that, I don't know. We might post it to our website with a link there. So give us a few days or a week to figure out the best way to do that. And we'll try to communicate through the same email loops to let you know where these show up and how to access them. But we'll try to get them on our website somewhere. By the way, if you don't follow us on social media or you don't get our emails directly, you may want to call our office and at least get signed up to get emails from IPS. We won't spam you with a lot of junk emails, but that way you get the direct communication. I know some of you heard about this because a friend or a friend of a friend emailed you, and that's great. But make sure you're getting our emails. And then social media, we have an IPS Facebook page, an IPS Instagram page. Friend us or like us there, and that'll help you know resources that become available. Did I miss anything that we have to do? We have to pray. That's what we have to do to close. So we will do that. Thank you for your time. You know, we started at 5 after and we're ending at 1:35. So this was a 90-minute shot. I know it's a long stretch, but I appreciate everybody who's on board here listening to us. We'll close in prayer. And any of you who want to chat with each other afterwards, we'll leave the room open for a little bit that you can do that. Again, our phone number is 209-575-2005, and you can get any questions answered or reach us there. Let's go before the Lord. Father, we thank you for this time. God, would you bless the time we've had? Would you help us to understand your world, understand your creation, and understand your law and your principles? Lord, help us to do that so we glorify you. Help us to do that so we can meet the needs of the poor. Help us to do that so we can best use our resources to evangelize the world, to share the gospel. God, I pray that our teaching today would bear fruit. There's a lot of content there today, probably too much content. Father, I pray that people would have a mind to review and study and learn and even to ask hard questions to perceive and find the truth. Lord, we thank you for your glorious, glorious mercy to us. We thank you for the salvation of Christ. Would you bless all that we do, bless your Christian ministries, and bless your church. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you, everybody.